Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us. This is the CTAC Patient Input Consultation for a new medication for treatment of HIV, TAF. There is unfortunately no commercial or brand name known for this yet, so we will continue to refer to it as TAF. CTAC is Canada's national civil society organization that addresses access to treatment, care, and support for people living with HIV and viral hepatitis co-infection. At CTAC, we meaningfully engage with a broad number of stakeholders ranging from people living with HIV and hepatitis C, frontline service providers, healthcare professionals, and policymakers. We work in collaboration to identify, develop, and implement policy and program solutions. Today we'll be talking about, as I said, the TAF medication. We'll start by going over the common drug review and how drugs are approved for public reimbursement, as well as a brief overview of the market access climate in Canada. I'll then present some of the key characteristics of TAF and discuss some of the key findings from clinical trials. Finally, I'll open the floor for a brief discussion and detail how you can have your voice heard as a person living with HIV or a caregiver. I'm going to start by playing a short informational video. This is a video we produced at CTAC to provide an overview of the common drug review. I hope you find it helpful. Again, it's very important you mute your phone line with *6 as I begin this video so we don't run into any feedback issues. Please and thank you. I'll be playing the video now. We'll resume shortly thereafter.
Canada has a unique healthcare system, and sometimes it can be complicated to navigate. Canada's healthcare system is made up of 13 separate provincial and territorial programs and 6 additional federal plans, making healthcare in Canada a shared responsibility between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. A drug can take as long as a decade to develop, and our regulatory review bodies might take as many as 5 more years to conduct thorough reviews. So what's going on during that time, and how do medical treatments get from clinical trials to a public insurance plan? Once a pharmaceutical manufacturer has created a new treatment or molecule, they must take it through clinical trials before bringing it to market in Canada. These trials evaluate whether a drug works and whether it's safe. A drug can take years to develop and study, with clinical trials often involving hundreds of people testing the drug. Manufacturers will create many molecules, but only those that prove effective during clinical trial are developed further. Some molecules are developed and never advance to become a treatment. It is important to consider that treatment development costs a lot of money, and manufacturers will generally seek to recoup those costs. When the manufacturer is confident that they have a competitive, effective treatment, they will submit the drug, along with clinical trial data, to Health Canada for review. Health Canada reviews the drug to determine if it provides clinical benefit and if it is safe. Once Health Canada concludes that a drug is safe and likely to provide clinical benefit, it is approved for sale on the market and can appear on private insurance plans. However, if a drug is to be listed in most of Canada's public formularies, the process is long from over. These are the public drug plans that many Canadians depend on in order to access essential medications. After Health Canada approval, the drug in question is reviewed by another body, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, or CADTH. This agency is funded by the federal and provincial governments except Quebec, which has an independent process. CADTH oversees a process called the Common Drug Review, or CDR, which conducts a review called Health Technology Assessment, or HTA. Many countries conduct HTAs, and there are different ways to measure health technologies. An HTA is conducted not just on medications and drugs, but also on any health technology, like a new pacemaker design, for example. Ultimately, the Common Drug Review seeks to answer the question, is this treatment cost-effective, and will it provide improved clinical benefits to Canadians? The Common Drug Review will assess the drug for listing on public insurance plans and must conclude whether it can provide equal or improved clinical benefit compared to its cost, and whether that makes it more cost-effective than similar treatments. How much money should be spent to achieve how much clinical benefit? Once the CDR concludes its assessment, it sends a recommendation to all health plans, federal, provincial, and territorial, as to whether or not the provinces should cover the cost of this medication and list it on their plan. The CDR will suggest that the provinces either A. list the treatment, B. list the treatment with clinical criteria and/or conditions, C. not list the treatment at the submitted price, or D. not list the treatment at all. Most treatments do not get an unconditional listing suggestion, and the majority are either not recommended for listing or recommended with conditions. In fact, in many of their reviews, the CDR has rejected or suggested not to list at a manufacturer's submitted price. Listing recommendations from the CDR are not binding or final. The provinces and territories receive the recommendation and are free to review the drug against their own standards or make their own conclusion from the Health Canada and CDR reviews. This allows provinces to realize local priorities and more closely manage provincial healthcare needs based on their budgets and populations. Each province does this independently, as each is the public payer of their respective province or territory. While many provinces and territories conduct their own reviews, some smaller provinces tend to follow the CDR recommendation and list or not list accordingly. As new drugs are developed and new needs are realized, provinces and territories must be vigilant to maintain a public listing that addresses contemporary local realities and responsibilities. Often, older treatments must be considered against newer treatments to see which contributes the most value for the most reasonable cost. This system is designed to review and respond to new treatments as they are developed, while allowing room for both price evaluation and regional healthcare priorities. Conducting HTA reviews at several levels with room for conditions allows provinces and territories more control over their public plans and healthcare mandates, while still allowing Health Canada and the CDR to review every treatment at the federal level. Timely and reasonable access to effective and safe medicines is a healthcare priority for Canadians, and while the processes described here account for cost, safety, and efficacy, some critics worry that they are redundant, duplicative, and very costly. Additionally, some critics note that the multiple points of review have resulted in some drugs being available on some public plans, but not others. Therefore, not all Canadians have access to the same treatment options. Is there a better way to realize our healthcare priorities at a reasonable price without rushing our review of safety and efficacy?
All right, so that was the common drug review in a nutshell, but let's summarize that process briefly. The first step is regulatory approval at Health Canada, where a new drug is reviewed for safety and efficacy. If Health Canada is satisfied that this drug complies with our food and drug laws and it is safe and effective, it is given a notice of compliance, and it can be sold on the commercial market in Canada. The next step has the drug submission reviewed by the Common Drug Review, or CDR. The CDR assesses that drug, further reviewing safety and efficacy, but also looking at the cost effectiveness and the social value. As part of this process, the CDR also solicits and reviews patient input and evidence. They want to hear from people living with the condition, as well as caregivers, and they use this information in their deliberation. You'll be pleased to learn that CTAC has several times been recognized for excellence in providing patient input reports to the CDR. Because most people access HIV medications through public drug programs, gathering patient input on new drugs is particularly important in determining the accessibility of medications in Canada. So ultimately, the purpose of this webinar is to alert you to a new drug submission being made to the CDR and to ask you to complete a survey on what you think about this new medication. The data from that survey will be used to create a report for the CDR. By participating in this webinar and completing the survey, you are helping us provide information to the Common Drug Review as they consider this drug for listing on public insurance plans. Just a minute here. Just give me 1 minute if we have a little bit of a technical delay here. So let's look at the treatment in question today, TAF. As I've said, we are not yet aware of a commercial or brand name for this. TAF is a once-daily fixed-dose combination therapy for the treatment of HIV, which consists of two drugs. The F in FTAF, counterintuitively, stands for emtricitabine. This is a nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor, or NRTI. NRTIs interact with an important enzyme in HIV replication and reduces its capacity to replicate. The TAF in FTAF is tenofovir alafenamide, which is a new prodrug of tenofovir. A prodrug is a version of a drug that is inactive until it's metabolized in the body. So making a prodrug is one way to alter or improve the way a drug is processed in the body, often avoiding or minimizing unintended side effects by selectively limiting how the body processes the drug. So these prodrugs, as I've said, are inactive until taken, and once processed by the body, they convert into their active form. So when TAF is absorbed by cells, it converts into tenofovir, which is also an NRTI. TDF, which you may have heard of, which is another prodrug of tenofovir, also does that, but it's a little bit different and delivers tenofovir differently. Now, TAF can be looked at as something of an indicator into how many new HIV treatments are being developed with an aging population in mind, acknowledging the long-term impacts of HIV medication. The great news is that people living with HIV are living longer, and more than 35% of people living with HIV in Canada are over the age of 50. Simply by aging, these populations are more likely to experience non-infectious comorbidities, such as cardiovascular disease, increased inflammation, etc. But of particular concern are the increased incidences of renal impacts and bone fractures when compared to the general population. Bone mineral density and renal impairment appear to be impacted by HIV treatments. But with the development of TAF, we've seen how we can alter how the body metabolizes treatments, and that can impact overall health while avoiding adverse impacts. So from a research perspective, it's interesting that we're learning about taking tenofovir over time, which prodrug of tenofovir is better for long-term use, and how to create a stable, safe backbone for future treatments. So as I've said, TAF is a prodrug. Smaller pill and lower tenofovir levels mean it minimizes bone and renal effects. In fact, there is evidence that the dose of tenofovir in TAF need only be 1/10 of the dose of tenofovir in TDF, the other tenofovir prodrug. And that's because TAF's delivery mechanism is different. TAF helps address the long-term needs of people living with HIV while being a potent antiviral agent. We're finding some significant benefits of TAF over TDF, despite their both being prodrugs of tenofovir, specifically when we're talking about bone mineral density and renal impairment and long-term use of this medication. So since I've mentioned TDF and TAF a couple times, let's elaborate a little more on that. You'll notice that for a webinar about TAF, I'm certainly talking about a couple other medications as well. And in fact, we just in October did a consultation for a medication called ECF Tap. So the components of ECF Tap and FTAP are found in many medications because that TAP, again, is tenofovir. Tenofovir is a very potent, commonly used antivirologic medication. So a large takeaway from this webinar would be the difference between TAF, tenofovir alafenamide, and which is what we're looking at today, versus TDF, tenofovir disoproxil fumarate, which is what has been traditionally used for tenofovir, as in Stribble, for example. So both TAF and TDF are different prodrugs of tenofovir. So TDF was approved for sale in Canada in 2002. It's very effective in viral suppression. For that reason, it's one of the most commonly used HIV treatments in both trials and in common regimens. For treatment-naive patients, TDF is a component in 4 of the 5 regimens recommended by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. TDF is also found in Truvada as a backbone for Tivicay, Prezista, and Isentress. So while Truvada is F-TDF, and we're talking about F-TAF, it can kind of be considered as something of a Truvada 2.0. There is, however, some concern about TDF use. As we've seen people using TDF over time, we're beginning to associate it with new or worsening kidney impairment, serious kidney disease, as well as some evidence of decreased bone mineral density in a small minority of people. So again, I don't want to belabor the point or be redundant. I want to make sure we see that there's a difference between FTDF and FTAF, and I think it's important to really make that clear. In fact, we may be looking at FTAF as a substitute for TDF in some regimens in the future. But what's really important to note here are the similarities. Both are based on prodrugs of tenofovir. Both contain emtricitabine. But I'm going to show you today that the metabolism of the prodrug at FTAF makes a very big difference. So here we see a bit of a summary for some of the key findings of FTAF. Right away, we're seeing better kidney health indicators, fewer instances of renal issues. We're also seeing a significant improvement to bone mineral density, specifically in the spine and the hips. As mentioned earlier, as we look at treatment options for an aging population of people living with HIV, this is a significant development. Patients can be more confident about their relative health moving forward on treatment. They can also be certain as a first-line regimen, this may help them manage HIV concerns moving forward, not just about renal impacts or bone health, but just as in terms of using this medication for a long term. There's also some evidence that looks as though TAF doesn't just minimize bone mineral density impacts, but may actually improve bone mineral density. Again, that's something that there's just a little bit of evidence for, and we're interested in seeing more development there, but that would again be a very novel finding. And again, another comparison, like I said, FTAF is a lot like another medication, ECF Tap, but with the E and the C removed. That would be elvitegravir and cobicistat would be removed. The result then is a novel prodrug with a great delivery system that contributes to overall health, while at the same time being similar to other medications that have already been approved as safe and effective. So don't be intimidated by this one. This diagram shows the biomechanics at work. The darker blue line or purple line shows how the prodrug TDF is metabolized into tenofovir, while the lighter blue line shows how the prodrug TAF is metabolized into tenofovir. So again, the end result is tenofovir in the body, but both of these medications deliver it a little differently. By virtue of its longer plasma half-life, TAF will contribute 90% less plasma tenofovir to renal cells than TDF. This means that more of the tenofovir attacks the HIV virus and less of it impacts renal cells. So TDF would enter the plasma and be converted to tenofovir in the blood, while TAF is concentrated at the cellular level and converted into tenofovir directly in the cell. So because it's not concentrated in the blood, as TDF is, early findings suggest that TAF won't affect the kidney or bones the way TDF does. And in fact, it might even be more potent against HIV, despite ultimately being a lower dose of tenofovir. It's a lower dose, but the delivery mechanism is more direct. So ultimately, more tenofovir gets to fight the virus, which is what we wanted to be doing in the first place. Now, as I've said, we're concerned about the impacts of both HIV and HIV treatment on an aging population. Comorbidities like bone density, low bone density, cardiovascular disease, and kidney disease are just a few of the things we see more often in people living with HIV. One of the risk factors is ART treatment, and we're still learning the impacts of long treatment regimens. Now, this is why it becomes more and more important to monitor treatment experiences and be vigilant in our observation of drug-drug interactions. Developing a new prodrug of tenofovir in FTAF is a clinical response to maintaining the efficacy of tenofovir while avoiding unwanted impacts of its metabolism. So again, let me acknowledge for a second time that I can appreciate for a patient input consultation on FTAF, I've also talked about several other drugs. Now that's because FTAF is both very novel and also very similar to other medications. As I've said, the big sell here is that it's a prodrug of tenofovir, so it's still very potent, but thanks to its new delivery system and different metabolism, it does seem to avoid many of the bone and renal impacts of TDF. So in Canada, the United States, and the European Union, ECF Tap has filed for use on public plans, and these filed submissions are based on a collection of 5 clinical trials. I've listed them here. These series of trials have involved more than 3,500 patients and is the largest, most comprehensive HIV filing to date. The data is very exhaustive and it's very, very thorough. Well, we're not talking about ECF Tap today. CTAC did that last October, and if you go to YouTube CTAC Talks, I'd encourage you to watch the ECF Tap presentation there. Today, however, we're talking about FTAF. So why do I keep bringing up ECF Tap? Because the 5 studies cited in support of FTAF, 2 of them demonstrate bioequivalence to ECF Tap. That means that FTAF has been proven to be at least as safe, at least as effective, and at least as tolerable as ECF Tap. This is important because many FTAF studies have not yet concluded. So while reviewing FTAF, please note that regulatory bodies will have some data that's demonstrated the safety and efficacy of FTAF, even though they're testing ECF Tap. So that means much of the data being used to support FTAF actually comes from ECF Tap studies. That may sound a little weird, but it's actually not that unusual. So looking at the last 4 numbers of the study names here, studies 1472 and 1473 demonstrate bioequivalence to ECF Tap. The other 3 trials, 1089, 1717, and 1269, are all FTAF trials specifically, but they are not yet complete. So let's first look at 1472 and 1473. These are the bioequivalence studies. These trials involve a switch. This means half of the participants receive one drug, and halfway through the trial they switch to another. In this case, the switch is between ECF Tap and FTAF. Both the boosted 10 milligram version of FTAF and the unboosted 25 milligram versions were used. We see over 200 patients being evaluated here. 1472 and 1473 each evaluate different switches between FTAF and ECF Tap, allowing the different arms to start with one medication and switch to the other respectively. And here are the results of 1472 and 1473. Here we can see that bioequivalence between FTAF and ECF Tap has been established. That proves the safety and efficacy of FTAF in as much as it can be proven from ECF Tap. So because that bioequivalence is established, some of that ECF Tap data will be used for FTAF review. The next 3 trials are not complete, but they're very interesting in and of themselves, so I'd like to share what we do know. This is 1089. This is another switch study that has patients switching from FTDF, which is emtricitabine plus the other tenofovir prodrug TDF, and they switch from that to FTAF, the medication we're discussing today. This study involves over 600 people, and its goals are to evaluate the efficacy of switching from TDF to FTAF versus maintaining FTDF. It's also evaluating the renal and bone safety at the midpoint and endpoints of the study. And this is in phase 3, so it's not yet concluded. But right away, we can see what the investigators are looking to get at. They're looking to get at whether or not prolonged use of FTDF can still be associated with renal and bone density issues, and whether that switch to FTAF somewhere in that course actually helps change that impact or reduce that impact. The 1717 study looks at 500 people, 250 in each arm, switching from ABC3TC to FTAF. It's randomized and includes a placebo. Now, ABC is abacavir sulfate and 3TC is lamivudine. So again, other popular HIV medications. And here it's looking to evaluate the efficacy of staying on ABC3TC versus the efficacy of switching to FTAF. Again, it has a secondary goal of evaluating safety and tolerability through to the endpoint. So again, we can infer what the investigators are looking for here. We're comparing FTAF, this new novel delivery mechanism for tenofovir, against pretty much everything else that's being used to treat HIV right now. This has some pretty interesting implications for the future of tenofovir, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit later moving forward. Finally, the 1269 study looks at adolescents aged 12 to 17 who have achieved viral suppression with 2 NRTIs and a third agent. It's looking at 25 individuals and is hoping to evaluate and assess the pharmacokinetics of TAF, as well as confirm the dose in children and adolescents. Again, another goal of this trial is to monitor safety and tolerability, and also, again, we're looking at principal investigators who I think by now have acknowledged FTAF may be something preferable to be used in an aging HIV population. But now let's look at children and adolescents and see how this works as a frontline regimen for treatment-naive patients. We have pretty high hopes for this one as well. But again, it's only in phase 2, so it's not yet complete. So let's have a quick summary of what we're looking at here with regards to FTAF. Ultimately, this is emtricitabine coupled with a new prodrug of tenofovir. And this new way of delivering tenofovir keeps drug levels low in the blood but higher in other cells. And this results in a significantly decreased impact to the bones and the kidneys, while still maintaining high rates of suppression associated with tenofovir, as well as increased CD4 counts. So let's also keep in mind that tenofovir is used in several medications right now. And one of them, in fact, is Truvada, which is being reviewed in Canada for use as PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis. It'll be very interesting to see what happens here, because Truvada is FTDF, but we're looking at FTAF, which is the new delivery mechanism for tenofovir. So will Truvada ever be resubmitted as FTAF in the future? Should we be concerned that the old prodrug of tenofovir is what's being reviewed for PrEP? Should we anticipate another Truvada as a PrEP review where it's not TDF anymore, but it's TAF, and therefore may be considered safer for longer use? We're just not sure at this point, but it is very, very interesting to consider. This is a new delivery mechanism for tenofovir, and tenofovir is a very popular HIV medication. It's a very effective HIV medication. So it'll be interesting to see what this means moving forward. And with that in mind, it's now your turn. The next step of the process will have us request that you complete a survey we've prepared. We will ask you about the impact of HIV on your life or that of your caregivers. We'll ask about the impact of any HIV treatment that you may have experienced. And we'll ask you what side effects are tolerable and which are deal breakers. Most importantly, federal and provincial regulatory bodies will receive your feedback. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and your attention today. If anyone has any questions at all, please feel free to mute your line by pressing #6, #6, and we'll be able to field those for you.